In 1953, a full-page advertisement in Good Housekeeping magazine made a declaration so bold it stopped women mid-page. Your skin is showing its age, but it doesn't have to. The product beneath that headline was Pond's Cold Cream, a pale, faintly medicinal-smelling preparation sold in a squat glass jar with a metal lid, and the woman holding it in the illustration wore the serene expression of someone who had discovered a private truth. The rest of the world was only just beginning to suspect. Cold cream, of course, was not new. It had been circulating in some form since the physician Galen mixed white wax and rosewater in ancient Greece. But what was new in post-war America was the ferocity with which it was sold, the urgency with which it was believed, and the elaborate ritual choreography that had grown up around it in the vanity rooms of ordinary suburban households. The cold cream revolution of the 1950s was not simply a story about a moisturizer. It was a story about what women believed their skin owed them, what the culture believed women owed their skin, and the remarkable industry that grew up to mediate that transaction. The material reality of a 1950s woman's evening skincare routine would be almost unrecognizable to a woman standing at a bathroom mirror today. There were no serums in droppers, no acid exfoliants, no microbiome-conscious cleansing balms. There was instead a small and specific arsenal of products arranged on a glass shelf or tucked into a vanity drawer, each one performing a function that was understood in practical rather than molecular terms. The cold cream came first and came always. Pond's was the dominant name, its advertising saturating women's magazines from Vogue to McCall's throughout the decade. But it was not the only player in a surprisingly crowded field. Woodbury Cold Cream positioned itself as the sophisticated alternative, its packaging just slightly more elegant, its fragrance just a shade more floral. Noxzema, in its distinctive blue jar, occupied a different register entirely, medicinal, cooling, faintly antiseptic, marketed to younger women and teenagers who associated the tingle with cleanliness in a way that felt almost athletic. These three products competed fiercely on pharmacy shelves across the country, but they shared a fundamental philosophy. The face must be thoroughly, devotedly cleansed, and cleansed with a cream that would simultaneously soften as it removed. The application method was not casual. It was a ceremony. A woman seated at her vanity in the evening, and the vanity itself was a piece of furniture with genuine cultural weight, a dedicated space where a woman's private self met her public presentation in daily negotiation, would first unscrew the lid of her cold cream with a gesture that had the quality of ritual. She would decant a generous portion onto her fingertips, warming it slightly against her skin before smoothing it upward and outward across her face in the circular motions that every beauty editor in every women's magazine of the era described with almost liturgical consistency. Upward. Always upward. The threat of gravity was a recurring preoccupation in 1950s beauty writing, and the upward stroke of cold cream application was understood as a small but meaningful act of resistance against the inevitable downward pull of time. The cream would then be tissued away, not rinsed, never rinsed, because water was widely understood to be drying, and dryness was the primary enemy. With a square of soft facial tissue held in both hands, and pressed, rather than rubbed, against the skin. A second application might follow for particularly stubborn theatrical or daytime makeup, and then, finally, a toner or freshener applied on a cotton pad to close the pores and restore what the cold cream had opened. The cultural context surrounding this routine was shaped by a very particular set of anxieties. The post-war American city had grown denser and more industrialized, and the women moving through it were increasingly exposed to what beauty writers of the era called city grime, the particulate matter, the soot, the invisible chemical residue of an industrial economy operating at full post-war capacity. The smog events that periodically descended on Los Angeles and blanketed New York were understood not just as respiratory threats but as dermatological ones, and cold cream positioned itself directly against this urban menace. Pond's advertising in particular drew a sharp line between the woman who cleansed faithfully each night and the woman who did not, and the consequences for the negligent woman were rendered in the language of accelerated aging, enlarged pores, and a complexion that had simply given up. This was not gentle persuasion. It was fear marketing with a velvet glove, and it worked with extraordinary effectiveness. What makes the cold cream ritual genuinely interesting viewed from the distance of several decades, is how precisely it mirrored the broader social expectations placed on women during the period. The discipline it required, the nightly faithfulness, the refusal to go to bed without completing the full sequence, the patient tissue off that could not be rushed, mapped almost perfectly onto the constellation of domestic virtues that post-war culture demanded of its women. A woman who maintained her skin was a woman who maintained her standards, and both her standards and her skin were understood as reflections on her character, her seriousness, and, by extension, on her husband and household. The beauty industry of the 1950s was remarkably skilled at encoding these social obligations into product instructions, and the cold cream jar sitting on a woman's vanity was never entirely innocent of that encoding. It was simultaneously a skincare product and a small, gleaming object of cultural expectation. Today, when a 12-step skincare routine has become a form of self-care rather than social performance, when the language surrounding skincare has shifted from duty to pleasure and from correction to wellness, the cold cream ritual reads as both charming and quietly exhausting. It speaks to us across the decades not just as a curiosity but as a reminder that the desire to care for one's skin has always been real, and the scaffolding built around that desire has always reflected the particular hopes and pressures of its moment. The specific women who appeared in Pond's advertising throughout the 1950s were not models in the anonymous sense the term implies today. They were, almost without exception, named socialites, debutantes, and women of sufficient social standing that their endorsement carried something more than aesthetic cachet. It carried class certification. Pond's ran a campaign for most of the decade that identified its users as women who had been presented at court, a reference to the formal presentation ceremonies at Buckingham Palace that remained a mark of social distinction even in post-war Britain, and the implication was unmistakable. Cold cream was not merely a practical product but a refinement, a habit of the well-bred woman that could be adopted by any woman who aspired to that register. The Duchess of Windsor appeared in at least one version of the Pond's campaign in the early part of the decade. Babe Paley, whose social position in New York was as precisely calibrated as a Swiss instrument, appeared in another. The product being sold in these advertisements was simultaneously the cold cream in the jar and the social aspiration of the woman holding it. The chemistry of what was actually happening to a woman's skin during the cold cream ritual was understood differently in 1955 than it is today, and the gap between the popular understanding and the chemical reality is instructive. Cold cream in the classic formulation, heavy mineral oil or white petrolatum, beeswax, water, and a small quantity of emulsifier, is an effective makeup remover and a reasonable skin softener, but its cleansing action works through emulsification rather than through any detergent or surfactant chemistry. The oil-based medium dissolves oil-based cosmetics, and the wiping action of the tissue removes both the cream and the loosened pigment in a single pass. What it does not do, despite the marketing language of the period, is deep clean in any meaningful sense, or close pores. Pores do not open and close in response to temperature or product application, a piece of beauty mythology so durable that it continues to circulate in modified form today. The toner applied after the cold cream was, in most formulations of the period, primarily a dilute alcohol solution whose principal effect was a cooling sensation and a temporary tightening of the skin surface that women of the era interpreted, reasonably enough given what they had been told, as the closing of the pores that the cream had opened. The vanity table itself, and its relationship to the architecture of the post-war American home, deserves a longer consideration than beauty history typically gives it. The post-war suburban house, built rapidly and at scale to accommodate the returning veterans and their new families, was not always generous in its allocation of private space for women's grooming. The master bathroom was often small, the bedroom crowded with furniture chosen for function over elegance, and the vanity table represented a specific and deliberate carving out of personal territory within the shared domestic space. It was, in a household where nearly every physical space served a functional purpose, defined by the needs of children or husbands or the logistical demands of domestic management, a space defined entirely by and for the woman herself. The fact that it was oriented around grooming, around the maintenance of her appearance, might seem to limit its claim to significance as personal space, but the women who use these tables do not seem to have experienced them that way. They were, by consistent account, places of genuine private ritual, spaces where the day's demands could be temporarily suspended in favour of a practice that was, whatever else it was, entirely one's own. There is something worth pausing on in the relationship between the cold cream ritual and the concept of maintenance as a form of self-respect that the 1950s embedded in its beauty culture more thoroughly than perhaps any other decade before or since. The women who performed this ritual were doing something that their culture told them was simultaneously for themselves and for others, caring for their skin because they valued their own appearance, and because the people around them valued it too, with the weight of those two motivations never quite separated, never quite examined as potentially contradictory. The cold cream on the vanity table was a product of an industry that needed to be sold, a habit of a culture that needed to be maintained, and a genuine small pleasure for the woman who used it and felt, for the few minutes of its application, that she was doing something careful and good for herself. All three of those things were true at once. The cold cream revolution of the 1950s did not create the female desire to care for the skin. That desire is very old and very real, rooted in the pleasures of self-attention and the social benefits of maintained appearance that are neither trivial nor reducible to mere vanity. What the decade's cold cream culture added was an institutional apparatus of enormous commercial sophistication and social pressure that wrapped around that genuine desire and made it very difficult to separate from the obligations it had been enrolled in. The women who used Pond's were caring for themselves. They were also, whether they knew it or not, participating in a system that had strong ideas about what caring for oneself meant and what it was for. Understanding both of those things simultaneously is the only way to read the cold cream jar on the vanity table with the full attention it deserves. The fragrance of cold cream, that distinctive combination of mineral oil and rose water, and the faint medicinal undertone of beeswax that anyone who has opened a vintage Pond's jar will immediately recognize, is one of the most potent olfactory triggers of mid-century feminine nostalgia that survives in the material record. Scent memory is the most persistent of the senses, and the women who used Pond's cold cream in the 1950s and are still living carry that fragrance as a kind of embedded document of their own beauty history, a chemical key to a nightly ritual that structured their relationship to their own faces for decades. The perfumers who formulated that particular scent did not think of themselves as creating a memory object. They were solving a technical problem of consumer preference in the early 1950s, trying to produce a fragrance that would read as clean, feminine, and trustworthy at a modest price point. They produced instead something that has outlasted its commercial purpose and become a sensory archive. This is not an unusual fate for a well-made object from the period, but it is worth acknowledging, in a series devoted to the beauty lessons of the era, that some of what the women of the 1950s learned and practiced and applied to their faces was beautiful enough to survive the decades and arrive, fragrant and intact, in the present. On the morning of March 25th, 1955, a makeup artist named William Tuttle arrived at his MGM studio kit station at 5:45 in the morning to begin work on a face that would appear on cinema screens 40 feet tall. The actress in the chair that morning was not yet famous for her cheekbones or her posture, but for a quality more difficult to name, a kind of incandescent composure that the studio's lighting technicians had been struggling to capture accurately for 2 years. What Tuttle understood, and what made him one of the most sought-after artists working the Hollywood makeup chairs of the early 1950s, was that film makeup was not about enhancement in the way fashion magazines use the word. It was about translation, the precise technical problem of converting a human face into something that would survive the violent compression of a two-dimensional projected image and emerge on the other side still legible, still emotionally present, still capable of conveying the full weight of a dramatic scene to an audience sitting 50 rows back in a darkened theatre. The studio makeup chair was where the science and the mythology of 1950s beauty collided most spectacularly, and what came out of it defined the visual vocabulary of femininity for an entire generation. The two dominant archetypes that organized Hollywood beauty in the early 1950s were so clearly delineated they functioned almost as ideological positions rather than mere aesthetic choices. On one side sat Grace Kelly, blonde and precise and self-contained, her makeup calibrated to create an impression of almost supernatural composure. Her foundation was invariably pale, her contour subtle enough to read as natural bone structure rather than cosmetic construction, her lip line drawn to emphasize fullness without excess. The makeup artists who worked with Kelly regularly described the challenge of her face as one of deliberate restraint, of creating a look that appeared to require no effort, while actually requiring extraordinary technical skill to achieve. A single misplaced highlight along her cheekbone could tip her from composed to blank, and the artists working on her films treated that narrow margin with the seriousness of engineers calibrating a precision instrument. On the other side of this cultural equation sat Marilyn Monroe, whose makeup was in almost every technical respect the opposite project. Where Kelly's foundation sought invisibility, Monroe's sought luminosity, the warm, slightly golden base that her primary makeup artist Alan Snyder developed specifically for her skin tone and the particular way she reflected studio light. Where Kelly's eye makeup created breadth and stillness, Monroe's created depth and invitation, the liner sweeping upward at the outer corner in a gesture that every woman watching from the theatre seats understood immediately as an expression of a very specific kind of availability. The makeup products moving through these studio chairs were not the products available in the local Rexall drugstore, though the drugstore products were themselves improving rapidly throughout the decade. Max Factor, which had built its reputation supplying Hollywood since the silent film era, maintained what amounted to a research and development operation inside its own studio contracts, and the foundation formulations it developed for film work were consistently ahead of anything available to the general public. Pancake Makeup, a water-activated pressed powder formula that Factor had originally developed for Technicolor film in the 1930s, remained the industry standard for motion picture work through most of the early 50s, valued for its ability to minimize pores, even skin texture, and create the particular matte surface that cinematographers needed to prevent the overexposed wash that plagued poorly made-up actors under strong studio lighting. The transition from Technicolor to the new widescreen formats introduced in the early part of the decade, CinemaScope debuting in 1953, VistaVision following the next year, required continuous recalibration of these formulas because the new formats captured skin texture with a fidelity that earlier filming methods had mercifully obscured. The theatrical costuming that surrounded and amplified this makeup work was itself an elaborate discipline operating according to its own rigorous internal logic. The wardrobe departments of the major studios in the early 1950s were staffed by dozens of specialized craftspeople, tailors, drapers, embroiderers, milliners, whose job was to construct clothing that served not the abstract ideals of fashion, but the very specific demands of character, camera angle, and narrative arc. A dress worn by a female lead might be constructed in 3 or 4 versions, one for close-up work where texture and surface detail would read clearly on screen, one for medium shots where silhouette and movement were primary, and one for the physical demands of action sequences that would have destroyed the principal garment. The woman sitting in that makeup chair was simultaneously an individual human being, a corporate asset requiring careful management, and a kind of collaborative artwork onto which the studio's collective ambitions were being projected. What the matinee archetypes of the 1950s gave to the women watching from theatre seats was a kind of map. The elaborate presentation of Kelly and Monroe, Audrey Hepburn and Elizabeth Taylor, Lana Turner and Debbie Reynolds did not simply entertain, it instructed. It showed women the range of femininity available to them, the technical means by which those femininities could be constructed, and the cultural weight that each version carried. A woman who left the cinema in 1955 and made her way to the cosmetics counter at her local department store was operating on information gathered from those projected faces, trying to understand which foundation, which lipstick, which angle of liner application would allow her to participate, however modestly, in the glamour she had just spent 2 hours consuming in the dark. The gap between the studio makeup chair and the bathroom vanity was enormous in technical terms, but in aspirational terms it was precisely bridgeable, and that was the genius of the entire system. The transition from Technicolor to the new widescreen formats had consequences that extended well beyond the camera department and into the costume and makeup departments, in ways that studio executives were slow to fully appreciate. CinemaScope, which 20th Century Fox introduced with the robe in 1953, created a canvas that was more than twice as wide as it was tall, and the implications for how actors were photographed and how their faces appeared in the frame were significant. The close-up, which had been a dominant tool of emotional storytelling in the standard aspect ratio format, became more problematic in widescreen because the vast expanse of screen surrounding a single human face created a compositional imbalance that directors found awkward to manage. The consequence was a shift toward two-shots and ensemble framing that put more demands on the full-body presentation of actors, rather than relying on the face in isolation, and this in turn placed new pressure on the integration of makeup with costume and movement in ways that the studio system had to work out in practice over the first several years of the widescreen era. The stars who navigated this transition most successfully were the ones who had developed a total physical discipline rather than relying on purely facial magnetism. Audrey Hepburn, who had trained as a ballet dancer before her film career began, moved through a widescreen frame with an ease that was partly the product of her training and partly a quality of physical self-consciousness that manifested as grace. Her makeup in her Paramount films of the mid-50s, Sabrina in 1954, Funny Face in 57, was calibrated by the artist Alberto de Rossi to support this total physicality rather than compete with it. Eyes strongly defined but in a way that read as expressiveness rather than decoration, lips kept relatively muted to allow the enormous range of her facial expression full latitude. The contrast with the approach taken for Monroe's 20th Century Fox films of the same period was stark. Monroe's makeup was consistently maximized, every element pushed to its highest legible intensity, because the camera in her case was not recording a dancer's full-body eloquence, but rather capturing the qualities of a face that communicated its meanings, primarily through stillness and surface. The influence of these studio archetypes on the general population of American women in the 1950s operated through several distinct channels. The most direct was the cosmetics counter at the department store or the local drugstore, where sales clerks trained to discuss makeup in the context of what was working on current film stars could translate the studio aesthetic into purchasable products at accessible price points. Revlon's Fire and Ice, as noted elsewhere, was explicitly presented as the means by which an ordinary American woman could access a version of the glamour on display in the cinema. Max Factor, trading heavily on its Hollywood credentials, marketed its Pancake Foundation and its Color Harmony cosmetics with advertising that showed film stars using the same products available on the retail shelf. This was not entirely accurate. The studio formulations were more sophisticated than their retail equivalents, and the application conditions available in a bathroom mirror were entirely different from those available in a professional studio. But the aspiration the gap inspired was commercially effective and culturally powerful. The Film Fan magazine was the third and perhaps most interesting channel through which the matinee archetypes spread their influence. Photoplay, Modern Screen, and Screenland published beauty advice columns throughout the 1950s that were ostensibly presented as direct communication from the stars themselves. Articles headlined with "My Secret Beauty Routine," attributed to Grace Kelly, or "How I Keep My Complexion Flawless," under Doris Day's name, that were, in fact, produced by studio publicity departments in collaboration with the magazine's editorial staffs. The beauty advice in these articles was often genuinely useful, because it had been filtered through the expertise of the studio's professional makeup artists and adapted for home use. But it was presented within a fictional framework of celebrity intimacy that served the interests of both the studios and the magazines, rather than those of the reader. A woman who followed the skincare advice attributed to Elizabeth Taylor was following advice produced by a publicity machine. She was also simultaneously participating in a form of parasocial intimacy with the star that the fan magazine economy depended on. Both things were true at once, as they often are in the long and complex relationship between celebrity culture and the beauty industry. The long shadow cast by the matinee archetypes of the 1950s over the subsequent history of feminine beauty in America has not always been acknowledged with sufficient specificity. The particular version of femininity that Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn represented, composed, refined, expressive within narrow emotional registers, was not simply replaced by the countercultural femininities of the 1960s. It was submerged and continued to exert influence through the professional feminine aesthetics of every subsequent decade, surfacing in the polished presentations demanded by certain categories of employment, in the bridal beauty ideal that the wedding industry has promoted with remarkable consistency since the mid-century, and in the persistent cultural association between a certain kind of controlled, deliberately assembled appearance and female trustworthiness. The Marilyn Monroe archetype exerted a parallel and differently rooted influence, surfacing wherever female sexuality was being mobilized as a form of cultural currency. The interesting historical observation is that both archetypes, for all their surface differences, required the same fundamental thing from the women who inhabited them: the subordination of spontaneity to calculation, the careful management of the image at the expense of the unmediated self. The studio makeup chair was where this management was most explicitly performed, most technically elaborate, most honestly named for what it was. Not beauty in any natural sense, but construction, deliberate and skilled and never innocent of the uses to which the resulting image would be put. The most durable legacy of the matinee archetypes is not any specific makeup look or hairstyle, but rather the concept of the deliberately composed public face, the understanding that appearance in the social world is a form of communication that rewards careful attention and repays the effort of construction with a specific kind of authority and presence. The studio system that produced the archetypes of the early 1950s was in most respects a constraining and often exploitative institution for the women who worked within it, and the archetypes it generated served the commercial and narrative needs of the studios at least as much as they served the creative needs of the women who embodied them. But within those constraints, something was also being demonstrated, something about the relationship between careful physical self-presentation and the ability to command a room, to hold an audience's attention, to communicate complex emotional states across the distance of a darkened theatre. That was genuinely useful knowledge, and that the women watching from the theatre seats absorbed and adapted and applied in their own contexts and on their own terms throughout the subsequent decades of their lives. The makeup chair was a site of exploitation, and also a site of craft. Both things were true in the 1950s, and both remain true in the industries that have succeeded it. The particular quality of attention that a precisely winged eyeliner creates is not accidental. It is engineered. And the women who mastered the liquid liner in the 1950s understood, with the intuitive expertise of long practice, that the line they were drawing along their upper lash margin was not merely decorative, but communicative, a piece of facial typography that altered the emotional grammar of the entire face. When Helena Rubinstein introduced her Mascara-Matic in the early part of the decade, a waterproof mascara in a wand applicator that represented a significant departure from the cake mascaras that had dominated the market since the 1920s, she was addressing one half of the eye equation. The liquid liner addressed the other, and its technical demands were severe enough to generate an entire subgenre of beauty instruction content in the women's magazines of the period. Mademoiselle, Glamour, and Ladies' Home Journal all ran detailed liner tutorials with diagrams, step-by-step photography, and sidebars addressing the specific challenges of different eye shapes, because the winged liner look that the era demanded was unforgiving of imprecision in a way that foundation or blush simply was not. The products available for liner application in the early 1950s fell into roughly 3 categories, each with its own technical personality and devotional following. The first was the small, flat-handled brush dipped into a pot of black or dark brown liquid liner, a category dominated by names like Arden's Velvet Smooth and the various house brand liners sold by department stores under their own cosmetic labels. These required the steadiest hand of all the available options because the liquid formulas of the period were unpredictable, in a way their modern descendants are not. They could bleed, they could skip, they could dry at slightly different rates depending on the humidity in the room and the temperature of the skin, and a single hesitation in the stroke would leave a thickening or a wobble that could not be fully corrected without removing the entire eye makeup and starting over. The second category was the cake liner, a compressed pigment cake activated with a damp brush, which offered somewhat more control because the medium moved more slowly and could be built up in multiple thin applications rather than committed to in a single definitive gesture. The third category, emerging toward the middle of the decade, was the felt tip or brush tip liner in a self-contained applicator, an early predecessor of the liquid liner pens that now dominate drugstore shelves, which sacrifice some degree of fine-point control for the considerable advantage of portability and consistency. The geometry of the wing itself was a subject of genuine technical debate among the beauty editors and makeup artists of the period. The variables were numerous. How far beyond the outer corner of the eye the wing should extend, at what angle it should rise, how thick the base of the wing should be where it connected to the lash line, and whether the lower lash line should be lined at all, and if so, how far inward the line should travel before being deliberately smudged or left crisp. The dominant silhouette of the early decade, influenced by the theatrical eye makeup visible on film stars like Elizabeth Taylor in Father of the Bride and Audrey Hepburn in Roman Holiday, called for a wing that extended perhaps 3 to 5 millimeters beyond the outer corner and angled upward at roughly 20 to 30 degrees from horizontal, creating what beauty writers of the period consistently described as a doe eye or fawn eye, an upward tilt that produced an expression of wide-open, slightly startled attentiveness. This was not the angular predatory wing that would characterize the early 1960s eye. It was softer, rounder in its overall effect, designed to maximize the apparent size of the eye and create an impression of open, dewy alertness. The social symbolism embedded in this particular eye shape was anything but innocent. The doe eye of the 1950s was a specifically feminized gaze, wide, receptive, slightly deferential in its openness, and its dominance in the beauty culture of the period was not coincidental. It contrasted sharply with the heavily lidded, almost sleepy sensuality of 1940s eye makeup, and the shift was interpretable as a cultural recalibration, a movement from wartime independence toward the suburban domesticity that post-war America was actively promoting through every available cultural channel. A woman with a perfectly executed doe eye was signaling something about her relationship to the world. She was alert, she was attentive, she was present. She was, to put it plainly, looking. And the particular way she was looking, upward, outward, with wide-open precision, encoded a set of social meanings that women of the period navigated with full awareness even when they could not have articulated the semiotics involved. The practice of applying this liner under the conditions available in the average American bathroom in 1955 deserves a moment of genuine acknowledgement, because the technical challenge was not trivial. Bathroom mirrors in the period were often small and poorly positioned, the lighting frequently overhead and therefore shadow-producing in exactly the wrong places, and the liner products themselves required a perfectly dry surface to adhere without bleeding. Women in the 1950s applied liquid liner while managing the uncertainty of an imprecise medium with imperfect tools under suboptimal conditions, and the standard of precision that was expected and largely achieved was remarkable. Today, when liquid liner is available in felt tip formulas with micro-precision tips, and instructional content on the application technique can be accessed in seconds on a phone screen, the achievement of the 1950s woman with her small pot and her camel hair brush looks almost athletic. The doe eye they created with those limited instruments was one of the most technically demanding beauty looks of the 20th century, and the fact that it became ubiquitous, that department store cosmetics clerks and suburban housewives and factory workers alike wore versions of it to work each morning, speaks to a level of beauty literacy and manual dexterity that the era rarely receives credit for possessing. The training required to apply liquid liner with the precision the era demanded was not available in any formal educational context. There were no accredited cosmetology courses specifically addressing the wing, no how-to films circulating through the educational channels that were becoming a significant medium for practical instruction in the early part of the decade. What existed instead was the Women's Magazine, which had been performing the function of practical beauty education since at least the 1920s, and which approached the liquid liner with the full weight of its accumulated instructional authority. Glamour's beauty department in the early 1950s was staffed by editors who had developed genuine expertise in cosmetic technique through years of product testing and consultation with professional makeup artists, and their liner tutorials were sometimes genuinely excellent, precise about the importance of elbow support while applying, explicit about the need for a freshly sharpened brush, or a new applicator tip for each use, honest about the fact that the perfect wing required practice and would not emerge fully formed from a first attempt. The practice sessions that women undertook in pursuit of liner proficiency took place, of course, at home, at the bathroom mirror, on evenings when the stakes of failure were low enough to permit experimentation. Entire magazines could be written, and essentially were written, about the specific challenges of particular eye shapes. The woman with deep-set eyes needed a different wing angle than the woman with prominent eyes. The woman with downturned outer corners needed a strategy for lifting the apparent line of the eye that the textbook wing would only reinforce in the wrong direction. These were problems that professional makeup artists solved routinely for their clients, but that the home practitioner needed to solve for herself, guided only by the mirror and the accumulated trial and error wisdom of her own specific face. The democratization of the winged liner look, it spread from the professional makeup chair into the general population of American women, was made possible by a collective self-education effort of remarkable ambition and scale. The mascara situation in the mid-1950s added another layer of complexity to the eye makeup project that the liner alone did not present. The cake mascaras that had dominated the market through the 40s required a damp brush, a degree of product build-up across several applications, and a very careful management of the setting time to prevent the lashes from clumping before the product had dried, a problem that was, in the era before reliable waterproof formulations, exacerbated by any atmospheric humidity or by the natural moisture of the eye. Helena Rubinstein's Mascara-Matic, the wand applicator that arrived in the early 50s, represented a genuine technological improvement in its convenience, but it also introduced the new and specific problem of overloading, of applying too much product in too few strokes, and producing a look that was more theatrical than the wearer had intended. The beauty editors of the period spent considerable column space advising women to wipe the excess from the wand before applying, to use a clean spoolie brush to separate lashes between coats, and to limit the number of applications to what was needed for definition, rather than pursuing the saturated darkness of the theatrical eye. This advice was not always followed, which is perhaps why the late 1950s produced some of the most dramatically lashed faces in photographic history. The social meaning of the perfectly executed doe eye rippled outward from the individual woman who wore it into the cultural landscape in ways that the beauty editors writing about liner techniques were probably not consciously tracking. The 1950s were a decade in which the question of what a woman should look like while paying attention was not a neutral one. The wide, upward-tilted gaze that the doe eye produced was an expression of attentiveness specifically coded as receptive rather than active, an eye that was open to receive impression rather than intent to pursue its own agenda. This was in sharp contrast to the heavily lidded, languid eye of 1940s film noir, which communicated an entirely different set of meanings about female interiority, and it was also in sharp contrast to the bold, geometrically aggressive eye that would characterize the early 1960s as the social mood shifted and women's relationship to their own attention began its long renegotiation. The doe eye of the 1950s sits precisely between these two poles, a transitional form that encoded in the angle of its wing and the careful geometry of its liner stroke, a very specific cultural moment in the long history of what women have communicated with their faces. The liner brush set down at the end of a 1950s morning, and the cleanup required when it went wrong. The cotton balls soaked in cold cream, or the small swab of petroleum jelly that could, with care, correct a crooked wing without removing the entire eye makeup, were part of a broader discipline of cosmetic error management that the women of the period had developed through practice and necessity. No tutorial could fully anticipate the specific problems of a specific face on a specific morning, and the accumulated personal knowledge of how one's own liner behaved on one's own particular eyelid, under the specific humidity conditions of one's bathroom, with the specific hand pressure one naturally applied. This was knowledge that could not be transmitted but only accumulated, and it was as much a form of self-knowledge as any more conventionally examined form of personal understanding. The doe eye that the decade required was demanding enough that achieving it consistently required exactly this kind of accumulated expertise, and the women who achieved it consistently were, in a very real sense, experts in their own faces. That expertise deserves to be recognized as the genuine skill it was, not a trivial vanity achievement, but a real and practiced competence in a difficult manual discipline, performed daily, under time pressure, with materials that punished imprecision, in the service of a presentation standard that the era maintained with unblinking consistency. The winged liner of the 1950s belongs finally to the category of beauty practices that are remembered as more uniform than they actually were. Every woman who applied her liner in the morning was managing the specific variables of her own face and her own materials and her own skills, producing a result that fell somewhere on a wide spectrum between the precise geometric wing of the magazine illustration and the imperfect, slightly wavering line of ordinary daily life. The range within the convention was enormous, and the personal style that individual women developed within the shared vocabulary of the doe eye was real and legible to other women, even if the beauty press tended to flatten it into a single prescriptive standard. The liner was a shared language with individual accents, and the women who spoke it most fluently were not the ones who most exactly matched the magazine diagram, but the ones who had found within its grammar the particular expression most precisely their own. In the autumn of 1952, a physician named Norman Jolliffe published a dietary program through the New York City Department of Health that he called the Prudent Diet, and though the program was designed to address cardiovascular disease rather than weight loss, it arrived at a cultural moment so saturated with weight anxiety that it was immediately and thoroughly reinterpreted by women's magazines across the country as a weight management solution. This pattern, the medical establishment generating dietary science for one purpose, the popular culture apparatus immediately converting it into beauty advice for another, characterized almost the entire nutritional landscape that American women navigated through the 1950s. The result was a dietary advice ecosystem of extraordinary incoherence, in which genuine nutritional science, spectacular quackery, and the purely aesthetic demands of a culture obsessed with a specific female silhouette existed in cheerful, chaotic proximity to one another, generating a decade's worth of diet fads that would be almost surreal to a modern reader if they were not also, in certain respects, uncomfortably familiar. The gelatin culture that gave this decade of dieting much of its distinctive texture was built on a foundation that was partly nutritional mythology and partly genuine corporate ambition. Nox unflavoured gelatin had been aggressively promoted since the 1930s as a nail and hair strengthener, and throughout the 40s and 50s the Nox company maintained an impressive marketing operation that kept gelatin in front of American women as both a beauty product consumed internally and a cooking medium of endless versatility. Jell-O, by contrast, had secured its position as an American cultural institution through decades of recipe promotion, cookbook giveaways, and celebrity endorsements that culminated in a post-war moment when the gelatin mold, aspic, dessert, or savoury salad stood as a symbol of domestic ingenuity and modern convenience simultaneously. The diet-specific application of gelatin in the 1950s drew on both of these streams. It was understood as protein-rich, low-calorie, and possessed of mysterious collagen-building properties that promised to let a woman lose weight while somehow simultaneously strengthening her fingernails and improving her complexion. The actual protein content of gelatin is negligible by modern nutritional standards, and the collagen claims were pure marketing fiction, but the conviction with which these beliefs were held and transmitted through beauty columns, women's clubs, and neighbourhood conversation was absolute. The tomato juice and egg yolk menus that circulated in various configurations throughout the decade occupied a different corner of the fad diet landscape, less corporate in origin, more amateur and vernacular, passed woman to woman through the same informal channels that distributed recipes and household tips. The basic logic was one of extreme restriction dressed up as nutrition: tomato juice for its vitamins and its diuretic properties, raw egg yolk for its protein. The combination meant to sustain a woman through the reduced calorie days required to achieve a figure appropriate to the sheath dresses and circle skirts dominating fashion illustration. These menus rarely survived serious scrutiny, even by the nutritional standards of the era, but they persisted because they promised exactly what their audience most desperately wanted: a specific, actionable prescription for a specific, clearly delineated goal. The vagueness of eat less and move more, which nutritional science in the period was already articulating in roughly those terms, was psychologically useless compared to drink a glass of tomato juice at 11 in the morning and eat half an egg yolk at noon. The high society calorie counting manuals that emerged in the early part of the decade represented the upmarket end of this dietary universe, and their production values were often remarkable. Slim volumes bound in pastel linen, illustrated with fashion drawings rather than photographs, presenting calorie restriction as a practice that distinguished the disciplined woman of taste from the undisciplined woman of appetite. Gaylord Hauser, the nutritionist who had made himself famous in Hollywood in the 1940s by promoting yogurt and wheat germ to Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, remained a prominent presence in this space throughout the 50s, his books combining genuine nutritional reform. He was years ahead of mainstream medicine on the importance of whole grains and fresh vegetables, with a personal charisma and social positioning that made dietary virtue feel glamorous rather than punitive. His 1950 book, Look Younger, Live Longer, had become a bestseller of almost scandalous proportions, and its cultural ripple effects continued to shape the dietary conversation among educated, fashion-conscious women for most of the decade. The modern mirror this period holds up is both obvious and uncomfortable. The calorie-counting applications on a smartphone in the 21st century are, in structural terms, the high society calorie manuals of the 1950s rendered in a different medium. The viral social media diet trends of the current era, the 23-hour fasting windows, the elaborate elimination protocols, the celebrity-endorsed supplement regimens, are the tomato juice and egg yolk menus of the digital age, transmitted through the same informal social networks, but at a speed and scale that would have astonished the women trading diet tips across their backyard fences in 1954. What changed between then and now is not, in any fundamental sense, the structure of diet culture. What changed is the volume of the noise, the number of competing voices, and the speed at which any given protocol can achieve both celebrity and debunking. The women of the 1950s were operating in a comparatively slow-moving information environment, which meant the fads lasted longer, and the social pressure behind any given dietary recommendation was more concentrated. Whether that represents an improvement on the current situation is a question the women of both eras might answer differently. The physician who occupied the most interesting position in the 1950s diet landscape was neither Jolliffe nor Hauser, but rather Hermann Thaler, whose 1961 book, Calories Don't Count, arrived technically just outside the decade under examination, but whose ideas had been gestating and circulating in the professional and popular press throughout the late 50s. Thaler's argument, that the composition of calories mattered more than their quantity, that a diet high in certain fats could actually promote weight loss by altering the body's metabolic behavior, was simultaneously ahead of certain developments in nutritional science and behind others, and its commercial trajectory was instructive. The book became a bestseller, the ideas spread rapidly through the women's magazine ecosystem, and the Federal Trade Commission eventually brought charges against Thaler for his promotion of a specific brand of safflower oil capsules in conjunction with his dietary recommendations. The diet book that turned into a regulatory action was a specifically mid-century genre, and Thaler's story illustrates the particular combination of genuine scientific interest, commercial ambition, and regulatory inadequacy that characterized the nutritional advice landscape of the period. The women who were the primary targets of this dietary advice economy were not, in the main, significantly overweight by any clinically meaningful standard. The historical photographs and film footage of the period show a population of women whose body diversity was real, but whose median weight would be considered by most contemporary medical standards entirely healthy. The diet culture of the 1950s was not primarily addressing clinical obesity. It was addressing the gap between ordinary human bodies and the extremely specific silhouette that the new look had installed as the standard of correct female appearance. The wasp waist, 22 inches in the most extreme fashion illustration of the period, perhaps 26 in a more realistic version, was not achievable by the majority of women regardless of caloric intake, because it was determined not by weight but by skeletal structure, and the skeleton is not a variable that responds to tomato juice diets. The diet industry of the period was, in this fundamental sense, selling a solution to a problem it had not accurately diagnosed, and the women who purchased that solution were setting themselves up for a cycle of partial success and renewal of the underlying anxiety that is recognizable to anyone familiar with the contemporary weight loss market. The role of the Women's General Interest magazine in sustaining and amplifying this dietary culture was enormous and, in retrospect, somewhat troubling. McCall's, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, and Redbook all maintained regular diet columns throughout the decade, featuring celebrity endorsements, doctor-authored programs, and reader success stories that collectively created a sense of dietary achievement as a normal female aspiration and dietary failure as a normal source of personal shame. The food advertising that appeared in these same pages, the Campbell's soup advertisements showing elaborate gelatin salads, the Jell-O campaigns promoting dessert molds as the proper conclusion of a well-managed household meal, existed in a peculiar tension with the diet content that surrounded it, and the editors who managed this tension apparently did not experience it as contradictory. A magazine that published a 900-calorie-a-day diet plan on page 48 and a gelatin mold recipe requiring a full cup of heavy cream on page 60 was not confused about its editorial position. It was accurately reflecting the actual lived experience of its readers in whom the desire to eat and the desire to be thin existed in complicated and permanent coexistence. The exercise culture that ran parallel to the dietary culture of the 1950s has received less historical attention than the food-based interventions, possibly because its products were less visually dramatic than a gelatin mold or a calorie counter booklet. But the decade saw the rise of a specific kind of women's exercise program. The Canadian Air Force exercises for women, the various calisthenics programs broadcast on early morning television, the Bonnie Prudden fitness movement that emerged from Prudden's 1956 book Is Your Child Really Fit?, and expanded quickly into a general adult fitness advocacy that represented something genuinely new in the relationship between American women and physical activity. These programs were framed not as athletic pursuits, but as maintenance, the keeping up of a physical instrument that was primarily valued for its appearance, but they introduced into the mainstream domestic culture a practice of regular intentional physical activity that would, over the following decades, be reframed as health and eventually as pleasure. The transformation of women's relationship to exercise from the 1950s to the present day is one of the more complete reversals in the social history of the female body, and its beginnings are visible in the calisthenics broadcasts of early television, where women in leotards performed jumping jacks in their living rooms with a slightly self-conscious air of people doing something that had not yet found its proper cultural category, the gelatin mould itself, that peculiarly mid-century object, trembling on its serving plate in its aspic or its lime jello with suspended fruit cocktail, so precisely calibrated to the aesthetic of its moment, is perhaps the best material emblem of the dietary culture that produced it. It required skill to make correctly, the proportion of gelatin to liquid, the temperature management that allowed the suspension of solid ingredients without their sinking, the unmoulding technique that released the form intact onto its plate without collapse. It was served as both a salad and a dessert, a nutritional ambiguity that the recipes of the period resolved by insisting on its virtues regardless of context. It was displayed at the table as evidence of the hostess's domestic competence, its intact and gleaming surface communicating hours of preparation, reduced to a few moments of theatrical presentation. And it was consumed under the sign of the diet, its relatively low caloric density invoked in the same conversational breath as its undeniable elegance. The gelatin mould wanted to be both indulgence and restraint, both pleasure and virtue, both impressive and responsible. A confusion about the relationship between eating and self-worth that the 1950s did not invent but pursued with particular intensity, and that anyone who has ever stood at a party table picking at something beautiful that they were not quite sure they should be eating will recognize with a familiarity that crosses the decades without difficulty. The dietary landscape of the 1950s was not only a landscape of restriction and anxiety, it also contained, within its contradictions and its excesses, a genuine popular engagement with questions about food, nutrition, and the relationship between what we eat and who we are that was real and important, even when the specific answers being proposed were nonsense. The women who read Gaylord Hauser and tried the gelatin diet and debated the proper ratio of vermouth to gin while serving deviled eggs at cocktail parties, were participating in a culture that thought seriously, if often incorrectly, about the material conditions of daily life and the choices available within them. The nostalgia that attaches to mid-century food culture in the present moment, the revival of the cocktail, the rehabilitation of the gelatin mould as an object of ironic affection, the persistent culinary interest in the elegant simplicity of a properly composed deviled egg, is a nostalgia not just for specific tastes, but for a kind of engaged domestic seriousness that took the rituals of feeding and presenting food as worthy of genuine attention and considerable skill. On a Tuesday evening in October of 1956, somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock at night, approximately 40 million American women performed a version of the same ritual. They stood at their bathroom sinks or sat at their vanity tables, and they divided their slightly dampened hair into sections, wound each section into a small, precise coil, and secured it against their scalp with a metal pin curl clip, a simple device of bent steel that was sold in packages of 50 at every 5 and dime in the country. Some of these women worked quickly and automatically, their fingers moving through a sequence they had learned as teenagers and performed so many thousands of times since that the physical memory had sunk below conscious thought. Others worked carefully, with the deliberateness of someone composing something that mattered, following the grid of sections they had planned in advance because they knew precisely what the morning would require of their hair, the degree of wave needed for the office, or the volume needed for the Saturday evening engagement, or the specific soft roll along the hairline that their husband preferred. The pin curl was not a simple matter of winding hair. It was applied physics, domestic choreography, and social calculation all practiced simultaneously in front of a mirror that reflected a woman managing her presentation on a schedule set by forces entirely outside her own preferences. The structural physics of a pin curl are, in fact, genuinely interesting. Hair, being a protein fibre with a particular molecular structure, responds to moisture and mechanical tension in predictable ways. When wrapped in a curve around a cylindrical form and allowed to dry in that configuration, the hydrogen bonds within the hair shaft reorganize themselves to hold the curve, a process that was understood practically by hairdressers long before it was understood chemically. The size of the curl, its direction, and the angle at which it was pinned against the scalp all determined the character of the wave it would produce. Tight curls set close to the scalp produced volume and lift when brushed out, while larger, flatter sections wound and pinned at a more shallow angle produced the broader, more relaxed waves associated with the soft, natural-looking hairdos that dominated the first half of the decade. The setting lotion, Lilt, Tony, or any of the several brand-name permanent wave preparations that had diversified into home-setting products by the early 1950s, was applied to damp hair before the pinning began, its chemical agents helping the hair maintain the curl configuration through the drying process, with greater reliability than moisture alone could provide. The metal clip itself deserves more consideration than it typically receives in accounts of post-war beauty culture. The standard pin curl clip of the period was a bifurcated steel device roughly 3 centimeters long, with a spring mechanism that allowed it to open, receive the wound curl, and close again with a small, satisfying snap. By mid-decade, the market had diversified to include plastic-coated versions, flat clips designed for specific waving patterns, and the large roller clips that were beginning to replace traditional pin curls in the arsenal of women who wanted more dramatic volume. But the basic metal clip remained dominant for most of the decade, and its presence on the heads of women all across America in the evening hours was so universal that it had acquired an almost totemic quality in the visual language of domestic femininity, appearing in advertisements, in television sitcoms, in the newspaper comic strips, as shorthand for a particular kind of female domesticity. The woman who had finished with her public face for the day and was managing the machinery of the face she would present tomorrow. The hair net that covered the completed pin curl set was the final element in this evening architecture, and its function was both practical and psychological. Practically, it held the clips in place during sleep, preventing them from being dislodged by movement and ruining the pattern the woman had spent 20 or 30 minutes constructing. Psychologically, it marked the transition between states, between the groomed, presented woman who had moved through the public world of the day and the private, working woman who was actively managing her appearance in preparation for the following day's performance. The hairnet, in this sense, was the most honest garment in a woman's wardrobe. It made visible the labour that the finished hairstyle was designed to conceal. The morning brushing ceremony that completed the ritual was its own distinct pleasure, separate from and in some ways more satisfying than the pinning that had preceded it. The clips were removed in a specific order, the hair allowed to fall in its set pattern, and then the bristle brush. Mason Pearson if a woman was fortunate, a less celebrated equivalent if she was not, was drawn through the set in long, gathering strokes that merged the individual curls into a unified wave or body of movement. The transformation that occurred in these 3 to 5 minutes was genuinely dramatic. What had been a head covered in small mechanical spirals of pinned hair opened and merged and softened into something that looked, and was intended to look, entirely effortless. This was the central deception at the heart of the pin curl ritual. The finished result was required to give no indication of the work that had produced it. The physics, the planning, the 30 minutes at the vanity mirror the night before, the slightly uncomfortable sleep with metal clips pressing against the scalp, all of it was meant to produce a wave so natural-looking that a passing acquaintance might genuinely believe the woman had simply woken up that way. The performance of effortlessness, in 1956 America, was itself one of the most demanding skills in a woman's repertoire. The chemistry of setting lotion formulations changed significantly between the beginning and the end of the 1950s, tracking a broader shift in the hair care industry's relationship to synthetic polymer chemistry that would ultimately produce the aerosol hairspray revolution of the later part of the decade. The earliest setting lotions available in the early 1950s were formulated primarily around natural gums, gum tragacanth, gum coria, dissolved in water or dilute alcohol solutions, producing a light hold that was sufficient to maintain a simple wave set but relatively vulnerable to humidity, the great enemy of any set style in the pre-polymer era. The introduction of synthetic polyvinyl pyrrolidone, known in the industry as PVP, as a hair fixative in the mid-50s was a significant technical development that the major hair care companies moved quickly to incorporate into their setting lotion lines. PVP-based setting lotions offered notably improved hold and significantly better humidity resistance than their natural gum predecessors, and the difference in performance was immediately apparent to the home user who had struggled to maintain her wave set through a damp summer morning. The permanent wave had its own complicated relationship to the pin curl in the domestic beauty practice of the 1950s. The at-home permanent wave kit. Tony had been the pioneer of this product category when it launched its home permanent in 1948, and by the early 50s the market included Lilt, Richard Hudnut and a dozen other brands competing on scent, curl texture, and ease of application. It was not a replacement for the pin curl ritual so much as a foundation for it. A woman who had recently given herself a Tony permanent was working with hair that already had wave memory built into its structure. The nightly pin curl set was the fine-tuning that directed and shaped that permanent wave into the specific style she wanted for the following day, smoothing and organizing what the chemical treatment had created rather than building wave from scratch. The two technologies worked together, and the women who understood their interaction were able to achieve significantly more consistent and more elaborate results than those who used either tool in isolation. The social ritual surrounding the morning presentation of a successfully set hairstyle had its own choreography that extended beyond the bathroom mirror into the kitchen and eventually out the front door. A woman who emerged from her bedroom with her hair properly brushed out and arranged communicated something to her household about the management of the day. She had risen early enough. She had allocated the necessary time. She had brought the nightly preparation to its intended conclusion. The husband's morning departure was a moment of presentation in both directions. He was presenting himself in his pressed suit and his knotted tie as a man of professional standing, and she was presenting herself in her belted house dress with her hair set and her face done as a woman who maintained her household and herself with equivalent seriousness. The labour involved in producing either presentation was invisible by design, but the evidence of its performance was legible to both parties and, implicitly, to the social world their household was positioned within. The bouffant silhouette that began its rise toward the end of the decade required the pin curl to perform a somewhat different function than it had in the soft, natural-looking wave styles of the earlier years. The bouffant, which teasing, lacquer, and the strategic use of a backcombing brush would render into the sky-reaching architecture of the early 1960s, required its foundation pin curls to be set in a configuration optimized for volume rather than wave direction, the curls placed to create maximum lift from the scalp when brushed out and then teased into position. This was a different skill from the wave mapping of the earlier decade, and women who learned it were essentially learning a new discipline, adapting the basic physical technique of the curl to a new aesthetic purpose. The transition between the two styles in the late 1950s is visible in the beauty magazines of the period, where the editors were carefully preparing their readers for the coming architectural revolution in hair while still addressing the considerable audience that remained committed to the softer, rounder silhouette of the earlier part of the decade. Both styles used the pin curl. They used it differently. That distinction captures something essential about the pin curl as a technology. It was not a single style, but an infinitely adaptable physical process capable of producing almost any wave shape the wearer desired, limited only by the skill of the hands that applied it and the structure of the hair that received it. The pin curl belongs to a category of domestic practices that were genuinely skilled, genuinely demanding, and genuinely invisible in the social accounting of what women contributed to the households and the social circles they maintained. The labour of the evening ritual, the damp hair, the carefully planned sectioning, the 30 minutes of precision pinning, was never separate from the other invisible labour of the household day, the ironing, the meal planning, the management of the 100 small logistics of domestic life that were so thoroughly normalized as women's work that their cessation was far more noticeable than their performance. The pin curl ritual was distinctive within this ecosystem of invisible labor, because its product was worn on the body. because the evidence of all those minutes at the vanity mirror went out into the world the next morning on the head of the woman who had produced it, drawing admiration for her natural-looking hair from people who had no awareness that any labour had been involved. The vanity mirror and the bristle brush and the pin curl clip were the tools of a craft that took years to master, and was practiced daily by tens of millions of women, and the resulting soft-waved hairstyles of the 1950s are, among other things, monuments to an invisible technical competence that the women who possessed it would rarely have been asked to take pride in and never been publicly thanked for. The physical memory encoded in the hands of a woman who set pin curls for years does not entirely disappear when the practice is abandoned. The women who grew up in the 1950s and practiced the pin curl ritual through their teens and 20s and into their married lives carry in their fingertips a knowledge that no instructional text could fully capture. The precise tension required to wind a curl tight enough to set but not so tight as to kink. The angle of the clip against the scalp that holds without pulling. The instinctive assessment of dampness that tells the experienced hand whether the hair is at the right moisture level to set reliably, or needs another few minutes. This embodied knowledge is a form of expertise that our culture tends not to recognize as expertise because it was associated with feminine domestic practice rather than with professional or intellectual achievement. But the hands that set pin curls were skilled hands, and the daily practice that developed those skills was a genuine form of mastery. And the women who possessed it knew their own hair with an intimacy and precision that the casualization of hairstyling in subsequent decades has made somewhat harder to achieve. In the spring of 1951, the Patricia Stevens Finishing and Career School in Chicago enrolled 342 young women for its standard 12-week course in what the school's catalogue described, without any apparent sense of irony, as the art of being a woman. The tuition was $48, which represented roughly 2 weeks' wages for a typical female office worker of the period, and the curriculum covered subjects ranging from the correct posture for entering an automobile, a manoeuvre requiring a specific sequence of seat placement, knee arrangement, and door management that the school treated with the seriousness of an athletic coaching technique, to the precise social grammar of a formal introduction, which apparently involved a choreography of eye contact, verbal formulation, and hand extensions so precisely specified that students were required to practice it in pairs under the observation of an instructor before being considered competent. The finishing school was not a novelty in 1951 America. Such institutions had existed in various forms since the 19th century. What was new was the scale and the democratization of the enterprise, the expansion of finishing school education from an elite pursuit to something approaching a mass market, available to the daughters of middle-class families who understood that the skills being taught were currency in a social economy that placed enormous value on a particular kind of controlled, graceful, feminine self-presentation. The posture work that formed the physical foundation of charm school training was genuinely rigorous and genuinely interesting as a study in the relationship between physical discipline and social performance. The book on the head exercise, which has since become a slightly comic emblem of mid-century finishing education, was not actually the primary posture training tool in most serious programs. It was a demonstration exercise, a test of the postural alignment that the instructors had spent weeks developing through a more systematic approach involving posture bars, mirror work, and the constant verbal feedback of teachers who could identify a dropped shoulder or a forward-jutting chin from across a room. The underlying physical principles being taught were sound, spinal elongation, balanced weight distribution, the relaxed placement of shoulders, and the slight engagement of the abdominal muscles that produces an upright stance without rigidity. And the women who came through these programs often reported years later that the physical training was the most durable and practically useful element of what they had learned. The grammar of parlour room introductions was a more socially specific matter, encoding hierarchies of age, gender, and social position into a set of protocols so detailed that they could occupy entire chapters of the etiquette manuals that supplemented the classroom instruction. The primary rule was precedence. A younger person was always introduced to an older person, which meant that the correct formulation required the introducer to direct their first verbal address toward the more senior party. A man was always introduced to a woman, which meant that the introducer spoke first to the woman's name. A junior employee was always introduced to a senior one, which created interesting complications in situations where social and professional hierarchies did not align. A young socialite being introduced to an older secretary, for instance, required the introducer to choose between competing precedence rules and almost always resolved in favour of age over social position. These protocols were not arbitrary. They were a codified version of social deference practices that had been accumulating for centuries, and they served the genuine social function of establishing status relationships quickly and clearly in a world that placed great value on knowing where one stood. The conversational boundaries policed by charm school instruction were, if anything, more elaborate than the physical ones. The safe conversation topics, acceptable for any social occasion and any company, were a remarkably short list. The weather, travel that did not involve political commentary, and the achievements of children were the classic standbys. The dangerous topics were longer and more nuanced. Politics and religion were the obvious prohibitions, but also money in almost any specific form, personal appearance beyond the most general compliment, other people's domestic arrangements, and anything that could be construed as bragging about one's own circumstances. The conversational ideal promoted by these programs was a quality the instructors called animation, a lively, responsive, apparently interested engagement with whatever topic the senior person in the conversation had chosen to raise, combined with a gift for asking questions that would allow that person to continue speaking without requiring the charm school graduate to contribute opinions that might prove controversial. The goal, as one particularly blunt instructor at a New York program was quoted as saying in a 1954 magazine profile, was to be the most delightful woman in the room while appearing to have almost no self to express. The modern reckoning with charm school culture is complex and necessarily ambivalent. What these institutions taught was real skill, the ability to move gracefully through formal social situations, to communicate across hierarchies and generations, to present oneself with deliberate care and managed precision. These abilities have genuine value in any social environment, and the women who acquired them were better equipped for many of the practical challenges of professional and social life than women who had not. But the specific value system that gave these skills their shape, the primacy of social harmony over individual expression, the subordination of a woman's own opinions and preferences to the comfort of others, the careful policing of any self-presentation that might read as unconventional or assertive, encoded a set of assumptions about women's proper social role that the following 2 decades would challenge so thoroughly that the finishing school as an institution never fully recovered. The posture is still worth learning. The reason for which it was taught is still worth examining. The finishing school as a commercial enterprise operated within a fascinating economic niche in the 1950s, one that required its proprietors to simultaneously serve 2 constituencies with partially conflicting interests. The first constituency was the young women who enrolled in the programs, often at their own initiative or under the gentle pressure of mothers who understood the social capital the training would produce. The second was the employers, department stores, airlines, hotel chains, modelling agencies, and the various corporate environments that were beginning in the early 1950s to think deliberately about the presentation of their customer-facing female employees, who made up a significant portion of the placement networks that the better finishing schools maintained and promoted as evidence of their program's practical value. The Patricia Stevens Organization, the John Robert Powers School, the Barbizon School of Modelling and Career Training, and the various regional equivalents that served markets from Boston to Los Angeles, were not purely finishing schools in the traditional sense. They were career training institutions with a specialized focus, producing women who were employable in specific categories of customer-facing work, precisely because they had been trained to present themselves in the particular way that employers in those categories required. The modelling component of these programs was interesting in itself, because it brought into the finishing school curriculum a set of practices and a body of professional expertise that had been developing in the fashion industry since the 1930s. Walking for the camera and walking for live audience presentation required different skills. Runway walking in the 1950s had its own specific vocabulary of turns, pivots, and presentation pauses that was taught systematically in the modelling programs, with students practicing on actual runway setups or in studios designed to replicate the live presentation environment. The posture and balance work foundational to this training fed back into the general charm school curriculum in ways that were beneficial to students who had no intention of pursuing modelling professionally, because the physical discipline required to walk a runway correctly, the spinal alignment, the weight placement, the management of forward movement through space, was genuinely transferable to the social grace that the general finishing curriculum was trying to produce. The dining etiquette component of charm school education was a subject so elaborately prescribed that the instruction manuals governing it could run to dozens of pages of specific guidance. The correct positioning of flatware in the place setting, the outermost implements to be used first, the dessert implements positioned horizontally above the plate, the fish fork with its distinctive tine configuration placed in its proper relation to the dinner fork, was a system of semiotic richness that communicated the host's knowledge and the guest's social education simultaneously. A woman who navigated a formal place setting correctly was demonstrating not merely practical competence, but cultural literacy, the capacity to read the social environment she had entered and respond to its conventions with the easy fluency of someone who had been educated into them. The specific behaviours governing how food was moved from dish to mouth, the bread torn rather than cut, the soup sipped from the side of the spoon rather than the tip, the salad not cut with a knife unless a salad knife had been provided, were in most cases genuinely archaic, their origins in table practices from an earlier historical period that made no sense in the present, but their performance was understood as a form of social respect, a demonstration of willingness to subordinate personal convenience to collective convention. The correspondence and telephone etiquette sections of finishing school curricula addressed a set of social technologies that were in rapid transition during the 1950s. The handwritten letter was still the primary medium for formal social communication. Thank you notes, condolence letters, formal invitations and responses, and the instruction in correct letter writing covered paper selection, the specific formulas of greeting and closing appropriate to different levels of social familiarity, the management of the envelope inscription in a period when the address itself was understood as a presentation surface, and the timing conventions that governed how promptly different categories of correspondence required response. The telephone, which had been a relative novelty in most American homes a generation earlier, was by the 1950s a ubiquitous domestic appliance with its own elaborate etiquette, conventions for the proper greeting when answering, the protocol for leaving and receiving messages, the understood limits of call duration depending on the purpose and the relationship of the parties. These conventions were shifting throughout the decade as the telephone became more deeply integrated into daily social life, and the finishing schools that were training women for professional and social environments were tracking these shifts in their curricula with the responsiveness of institutions whose commercial value depended on the currency and practical applicability of what they taught. The graduates of the finishing schools of the 1950s went on to occupy roles that the training had prepared them for, with varying degrees of correspondence to the original design. Some entered the modelling and airline and department store careers that the school's placement offices facilitated. A significant number married, which the schools themselves presented not as an alternative to career, but as a destination for which the training was equally relevant, since the management of a socially ambitious household required the same skills as the management of a corporate reception desk. A smaller number found that the disciplines of self-presentation they had acquired were useful in professional contexts that the charm school industry had not anticipated, because the 1950s were a decade in which women's entry into corporate and professional life was expanding at a pace that the finishing schools were only beginning to track. The posture and poise and conversational management that the schools taught were genuine professional assets in environments where women's competence was evaluated partly on the basis of their social presentation, and the graduates who understood this deployed their training with a sophistication that the school's original framing as preparation for domestic and modelling life had not fully anticipated. The charm school produced in its better graduates something more than it advertised, not simply polished young women, but women who had been given a systematic education in the relationship between physical self-presentation and social authority, and who could use that education in any context that rewarded a woman for knowing exactly how to walk into a room. The finishing schools of the 1950s closed or transformed in the decades that followed, their original model rendered commercially unviable by the social changes that made their curriculum seem simultaneously antiquated and incomplete. Antiquated in its emphasis on deference and social protocol, incomplete in its neglect of the professional skills that women increasingly needed as they entered the workforce in larger numbers and in more demanding roles. What replaced them was not a single institution, but a dispersed ecology of professional development programs, self-help publishing, corporate training initiatives, and the informal mentorship networks that women built within their professional environments to transmit exactly the kind of socially sophisticated, navigational knowledge that the charm schools had once formalized. The knowledge itself, how to walk into a room and be taken seriously, how to manage a difficult social interaction without either capitulating or escalating, how to present oneself with deliberate intention rather than anxious improvisation, remains as useful as it was in 1953. Only the packaging has changed, and the packaging, as the charm schools themselves would have been the first to acknowledge, matters enormously. In the spring of 1953, a woman named Dorothy Gray sat at the powder room vanity of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City and opened a compact. The compact itself was an Elgin American design. The case was gold plate over brass, its lid engraved with a baroque floral pattern that caught the powder room light in a way that was frankly magnificent, and the small mirror set into the interior was slightly convex in the manner of the better compacts of the period, which made the reflection it produced softer and more flattering than a perfectly flat surface would have allowed. She pressed her powder puff, a thick disc of chamois soft velvet, monogrammed in her initials because that is the kind of detail that mattered enormously in 1953, against the pressed powder inside, and drew it across her nose and forehead with a gesture so refined by practice that it required no visible thought. She snapped the compact shut with the small, definitive click that was one of the characteristic sounds of mid-century femininity, and she returned it to her beaded evening bag alongside her lipstick case and her small folded handkerchief. The entire operation had taken perhaps 45 seconds. It had also been, in ways she might have found excessive to articulate, an act of considerable social meaning. The compact occupied a unique position in the material culture of 1950s femininity because it was simultaneously functional and theatrical, personal and public, intimate in its actual use, and yet explicitly designed for use in social settings. Unlike the cold cream jar on the bathroom vanity, or the setting lotion on the shelf above the tub, objects that existed entirely within the private architecture of a woman's grooming routine, the compact was designed from the beginning to be seen. Its exterior was meant to make an impression. The quality of the case, the elegance of the design, the presence or absence of precious metal, precious stone, or fine enamel work on the exterior surface all communicated information about the woman, who carried it in a social register that was immediately legible to other women, and by extension to any man sophisticated enough to notice. The compact was a small luxury object that could be carried without ostentation, produced without announcement, and returned to the purse with the minimum of ceremony, a precision instrument of social self-presentation that required no installation and no explanation. The British manufacturer Stratton, which had been producing compacts since the 1930s, and which developed its distinctive self-opening lid mechanism in the late 40s, dominated the collector's tier of the compact market throughout the 1950s, with a range of designs that balanced technical quality with decorative ambition. A Stratton compact in the mid-50s was a serious object. The gold fill and silver fill cases were made to last, the mirror was reliably clear, and the self-opening mechanism, which allowed the compact to spring open with a single-hand operation rather than requiring both hands to pry at a conventional lid, was a genuine convenience innovation, in an era when women's gloves made precise small motor operations genuinely challenging. But the American manufacturers were producing equally covetable objects. Elgin American's die-cast zinc alloy cases with their intricate surface treatments, Evans Case Company's enamel work, and the various compacts produced by Volupté, whose name alone communicated something about the particular register of luxury it was pitching. The department stores displayed these objects in glass cases with the seriousness they now reserve for watches and fine jewellery, and the saleswomen who managed those counters needed to be knowledgeable about hinge mechanisms and powder formulations in roughly equal measure. The etiquette of public nose powdering was a subject of genuine, earnest debate in the women's magazines of the period, and the positions taken were more varied and more contested than might be expected. One faction, represented most prominently by the Amy Vanderbilt School of Social Conduct, held that a woman should never touch up her face in a public setting, other than the designated and appropriate context of a restaurant powder room or a theatre lobby mirror, that applying powder or lipstick at a dinner table was a form of social exhibitionism that called unwanted attention to the mechanics of one's appearance, and therefore undermined the illusion of natural grooming that all this careful attention was meant to produce. The opposing faction, considerably less formal in its approach, held that brief compact use at a table or in the company of friends was not merely acceptable but rather charming, evidence of a woman's unself-conscious ease in her own body, her relaxed relationship with the rituals of her femininity. Both positions agreed on one point. The compact itself should be beautiful enough to bear public examination, because once produced in a social setting, it would inevitably be noticed, and the judgment it attracted would reflect on its owner. The psychological weight of the compact as a personal object was something that both its marketing and its collectors acknowledged explicitly. The personalized compact, engraved with initials, set with the birthstone of its recipient, given as a gift for a significant birthday or an anniversary, was a specific genre of intimate gift that communicated care, attention, and knowledge of the recipient's tastes in a way that more general gifts could not. To give a woman a fine compact was to communicate that you had observed her use compacts, that you had formed a judgment about the quality of compact appropriate to her social position and personal style, and that you had invested time and money in honouring that judgment. The compact as gift and the compact as keepsake remained intertwined throughout the decade, and the women who kept their compacts long after the pressed powder inside had been exhausted and never replaced were keeping not just an object but a record of an occasion, a relationship, a moment in their own social history that the small engraved case could hold as accurately as any photograph. The pressed powder itself, the cosmetic contained within the compact, was a more technically complex product than its apparent simplicity suggested. The formulation challenge for a powder intended for pressed cake application was significant. The powder needed to be compressed firmly enough to survive the ordinary handling of daily use without crumbling, but lightly enough that the puff would pick up sufficient product with a light pressure, and the binders that achieved this balance also needed to be invisible on the skin in a range of lighting conditions, from fluorescent office lighting to the warm incandescence of evening dinner lighting. Coty, which had been producing pressed powder longer than almost any other American cosmetics company, maintained a formulation laboratory in New Jersey throughout the 1950s that employed genuine chemists working on these problems with the seriousness of pharmaceutical researchers, because in a competitive market where the difference between Coty's airspun and a competitor's offering was the tactile experience of the product on a customer's skin, the chemistry was genuinely important. The colour range available in pressed powder throughout the 1950s was structured around a relatively small number of descriptive categories that we would recognise today as tending toward a particular end of the human skin tone spectrum. Rachel Natural Ivory, Cream, Blush and Suntan were the standard descriptors across most brand offerings, with occasional variations in nomenclature from brand to brand. The implicit reference point of the category, the norm around which these descriptors were organised, was a Northern European complexion, and women whose skin fell outside this reference range were expected to identify their nearest match within a system that had not been designed with them in mind. This was a limitation that the American cosmetics industry would not begin to seriously address for another several decades, and its presence in the pressed powder category is as clear an example as any of the ways in which the beauty industry of the period built its products and its language around an assumption of a specific user that was never stated but was visible in every product decision. The compact as a vehicle for advertising and brand identity was exploited with increasing sophistication as the decade advanced. The branded compact, a compact carrying the decorative iconography of a cosmetics brand rather than a generic or purely geometric design, allowed companies like Revlon, Elizabeth Arden, and Estee Lauder, which was just beginning its rise to prominence in the department store market in the early 50s, to turn the compact itself into a piece of walking brand communication. A woman who produced a Revlon compact at a dinner table was simultaneously doing her nose and displaying her cosmetic brand allegiance in a social context that gave that display maximum visibility. The brands understood this perfectly well. The packaging design budgets that went into compact development at the major cosmetics companies were significant, and the results of that investment, the distinctive red and gold of Revlon's design language, the spar green of Elizabeth Arden, the austere ivory and black that Chanel maintained across its entire cosmetics range, were not accidental but the product of deliberate brand management. The secondary market for vintage compacts that exists today, the specialist dealers, the online auction platforms, the collector communities that trade in Stratons and Elgin Americans and voluptés with the focused attention of numismatists, represents a form of material history that is not always taken seriously by academic historians, but that preserves a record of mid-century design culture that photographs and advertisements cannot fully convey. To hold a 1954 Stratton compact, to feel the weight of the gold fill case in the palm, to operate the self-opening lid and hear the small precise sound it makes, to open it and meet the slightly convex mirror and the intact pad of pressed powder, still faintly fragrant after 70 years, is to experience the material culture of the decade in a way that is fundamentally different from looking at it in a magazine. The objects themselves are arguments about what the period valued: precision engineering, decorative ambition, the conviction that a small everyday object could be worth making beautifully. The women who used these compacts were daily in contact with objects of genuine quality, and the quality communicated something to them about their own worth that the cheap, disposable cosmetics packaging of a later era would no longer bother to say. The compact trade at department store cosmetics counters throughout the 1950s was one of the more reliable commercial rituals of the holiday gift-giving economy, and the counter-display cases that the manufacturers stocked for the Thanksgiving to Christmas selling period were among the most carefully considered retail presentations in the store. The gift compact, a more decorative version of the everyday compact, often featuring additional embellishment and packaged in presentation boxes rather than simply wrapped in tissue, was a reliable gift category for husbands who had been instructed that their wives wanted something in the cosmetics department, but who needed the guidance of a knowledgeable salesperson to navigate the distinctions between a compact their wife would treasure and one she would use once and relegate to the back of a drawer. The saleswomen who guided these transactions were performing a genuine service on both sides, matching the gift to the recipient's tastes and the buyer's budget in ways that required real knowledge of both parties, at least one of whom, the recipient, was not present to advocate for herself. The gifted compact that arrived on Christmas morning wrapped in the department store's signature paper was a communication between giver and receiver that the object itself made possible. The quality of the case said something about how the giver valued the recipient, and the decorative character of the design said something about how the giver understood her taste. The compact was a love language in a period that had not yet developed that particular terminology, but was operating within its logic with considerable sophistication. The compact sits today in a peculiar position in the material culture of cosmetics, still manufactured, still purchased, still carried in women's purses across the full range of price points from drugstore to luxury, but no longer quite the socially loaded object it was in 1955. The powder room culture that gave the compact much of its public life has largely given way to the bathroom selfie and the ring-lit phone camera as the primary instrument of midday appearance management, and the gesture of producing a compact at a table has been largely replaced by the more private gesture of checking a phone for the photograph that shows you how you currently look. These are different practices. One produces a tactile object in a social space, the other produces a digital image in a private one, and the difference in how they function socially is real, even if the underlying desire they serve is the same. The women who flipped open their Stratton compacts at a dinner table in 1958 were doing something visible, something that announced itself to the people around them. The woman who checks her camera roll in a restaurant bathroom is doing something invisible, something that happens in the same intimate territory as the pin curl ritual, between herself and her reflection, without an audience, without the small, ceremonial click of a closing lid. In the late summer of 1958, the editors of House Beautiful magazine published what they described as a complete guide to cocktail party excellence that ran to 14 illustrated pages and addressed everything from the correct height at which a tray should be held by a circulating servant, or, in the households that lacked servants, by the hostess herself, who was advised to practice the tray-holding position in front of a mirror for at least a week before the event, to the specific proportions of vermouth to gin in a properly mixed martini. The martini instructions were, in retrospect, the most interesting element of the guide, because they illustrated with extraordinary clarity the intensity of ritual precision that the mid-century cocktail hour demanded. A martini was not merely a drink in 1958 America. It was a performance of sophistication, a demonstration of technical competence, a social statement about the seriousness with which the host or hostess approached the obligations of adult domestic entertainment. Getting the proportions wrong was not simply a matter of producing an inferior drink, it was evidence of a failure of standards that extended, in the social calculus of the period, into an implicit comment on every other aspect of the household's management. The suburban domestic hostess of the 1950s occupied a professional position that her own culture was unwilling to name as such, but that was, in its actual demands, remarkably complex. The preparation required for a successful cocktail party, which in the middle of the decade typically began at 6 in the evening and ran until 8, bridging the gap between the husband's return from work and the dinner hour in the gracious domestic theatre of the living room, began at least 2 days before the event itself. The crystal glassware needed to be washed and polished to a spotlessness that admitted no fingerprints. The bar cart, a piece of furniture whose prominence in the 1950s living room has never been adequately acknowledged, needed to be stocked and arranged according to a protocol that was partly functional and partly aesthetic, with the primary spirits displayed prominently and the mixing implements positioned for maximum efficiency. The ice situation was a recurring logistical challenge throughout the decade, before the widespread adoption of automatic ice-making refrigerators and the hostess who had worked out a reliable system for producing sufficient quantities of ice for a cocktail party of 12 was a woman who had solved a genuine operational problem. The deviled egg deserves its own moment of genuine appreciation in any account of the mid-century cocktail party, because it illustrates something important about the culinary aesthetic of the period that tends to be overlooked in the nostalgia treatments of 1950s food culture. The deviled egg was not a simple dish. Its preparation required precision timing in the boiling of the eggs, a specific technique for the clean removal of shells without damaging the white, and a filling formulation that balanced the richness of the yolk with the sharpness of the mustard and the particular tang of Hellmann's mayonnaise in a ratio that every accomplished hostess considered to be her own proprietary secret. The eggs then had to be piped, and piping was a skill that required practice, the right equipment, and the particular kind of patient dexterity that was valued and cultivated in the domestic education of women of the period, filled with a smooth, slightly peaked mound of the yellow filling, finished with a paprika dusting applied with a light and even hand, and arranged on a serving platter with the geometric precision that the aesthetic of the period demanded. They were invariably eaten first, which represented both a triumph and a minor catastrophe for the hostess who had spent 40 minutes arranging them. The conversation management skills required of the cocktail party hostess were a direct extension of the charm school curriculum, but deployed at a higher level of difficulty because the variables were more numerous and the stakes were higher. A dinner party of 8 presented one set of social management challenges. A cocktail party of 20 or 25 presented another entirely. The hostess needed to monitor not just the individual conversations happening in her living room, but the emotional climate of the room as a whole, identifying the conversational clusters that were flagging and needed to be refreshed by the introduction of a new guest, identifying the clusters that were becoming animated in ways that might tip from lively to contentious, and managing the positioning of guests whose social chemistry was known to be combustible. The crystal glassware itself was a tool in this management. The hostess, who kept her eye on the level of liquid in her guests' glasses, was performing a monitoring function that was simultaneously hospitable and supervisory, because the management of alcohol consumption in a social setting was understood as one of the hostess's core responsibilities. What the mid-century cocktail hour gave to its participants that the modern equivalent struggles to replicate was a kind of structured social time, a defined period with clear beginning and end points, specific behavioural conventions that relieved guests of the anxiety of not knowing how to act, and a physical setting carefully curated to facilitate conversation rather than distract from it. There were no glowing rectangles competing for attention. There was the bar cart, the bowl of nuts, the tray of deviled eggs, the crystal glasses catching the lamplight, and the other people in the room. The social technology of the cocktail hour, the timing, the pacing, the provisioning, the conversational management, was designed to make those other people seem interesting and worth talking to, and in the hands of a skilled hostess it succeeded with a consistency that modern, informal entertaining, with all its superior food options and its far more relaxed protocols, does not always match. The bar cart itself was a piece of furniture with a social history that the 1950s had inherited from the pre-war era, and amplified into something approaching cultural iconography. The chromium and glass serving trolley, the rattan bar cart with its hurricane lamp and ice bucket, the sleek Danish modern teak cart with its integrated bottle holders, These objects appeared in Shelter magazine photographs throughout the decade with the prominence of statements rather than furnishings, suggesting that the household capable of outfitting a proper bar cart was a household of a specific social character. The liquors displayed on the cart were themselves a form of social communication. A well-stocked bar in 1958 included Scotch whisky for the serious drinker, bourbon for the traditional one, vodka, rapidly ascending from its relative obscurity to mainstream respectability under the influence of the Moscow Mule, which Smirnoff had been promoting since the late 40s, for the fashionable one, and the sweet vermouth and dry vermouth necessary for the canonical cocktails that any host was expected to produce competently. The gin occupied the central position in this array because the martini remained the emblematic cocktail of the period, and the martini was a test. The glassware selection for a cocktail party in the early 1950s reflected a more specialised and more culturally invested set of decisions than the modern host typically faces. The crystal versus glass question was a social distinction with real implications. Waterford or Baccarat crystal on a bar cart communicated one category of household. Matched but unpedigreed pressed glass communicated another. Mismatched glasses of varying origin communicated something else entirely, which in the context of a deliberate social event was generally understood as either bohemian indifference or modest means. The shape of the glass was non-negotiable. The martini glass with its wide, shallow bowl and its long stem was the appropriate vessel for the eponymous cocktail, and serving a martini in anything else was an error that a knowledgeable guest would notice and a gracious guest would not mention. The old-fashioned glass, squat, heavy, weighted in the hand, was the correct vessel for the bourbon and branch water, or the old-fashioned cocktail that the older or more conservative guest might prefer. The highball glass served the whiskey soda and the vodka tonic and the various mixed drinks that occupied the middle of the spectrum between the serious straight spirit drinks and the sweet, fruit-based cocktails at the periphery. The domestic hostess of the 1950s was operating in an environment where her performance as a social manager was evaluated by guests who were themselves expert in the conventions she was being asked to demonstrate. This is a different situation from modern informal entertaining, where the conventions are sufficiently relaxed and varied that there is no single standard against which a host's choices can be measured. The 1950s cocktail party operated within a system of explicit and shared expectations, and the evaluation of a hostess's success was both immediate and social. The guests knew what a properly appointed bar cart looked like, what correctly prepared deviled eggs tasted like, what the right pacing of the evening felt like, and the host was producing her party against this shared standard in real time. The pressure this created was real, and was widely acknowledged in the domestic advice literature of the period, which devoted considerable space to reassuring anxious hostesses that perfection was not required, while simultaneously providing extremely detailed instructions for achieving something very close to it. The morning after cleaning ritual that followed the cocktail party was not often discussed in the domestic advice literature, but was as carefully managed as the preparation that preceded the event. Crystal glass is hand-washed in tepid water with a small quantity of mild detergent and dried immediately with a lint-free cloth to prevent water spotting. The bar cart restocked and the empties disposed of before the children came downstairs. The cocktail napkins, linen, not paper, in a household with any pretension to correct entertaining, collected, pre-treated for lipstick stains, and set to soak before the regular laundry cycle. The mark of a household that had given a successful cocktail party was that 24 hours later there was no visible evidence that a party had occurred, the house restored to its standard of daily presentation as efficiently as the party had been mounted. The ability to receive and to recover, to open the household to guests and then to close it again without disruption to its ordinary management, was one of the practical skills that the 1950s hostess was most comprehensively evaluated on, and the women who managed it well were regarded within their social circles with the specific admiration reserved for a difficult performance made to look effortless. The decline of the cocktail party as a dominant form of suburban social entertainment began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 70s, driven by a confluence of forces that had been building throughout the period under examination here. The informalization of social life, the relaxation of the dress conventions, the loosening of the conversational protocols, the introduction of the backyard barbecue and the potluck supper as legitimate alternatives to the catered and controlled environment of the cocktail hour, represented a genuine shift in what Americans wanted from their social occasions and from each other. But the cocktail party did not simply vanish. It transformed, shedding the more elaborate requirements while retaining the core structure of the brief, standing, drinks-in-hand social gathering that remains one of the more functional formats for managing the social obligations of a busy adult life. The bar cart, which had seemed on the verge of disappearance in the 1970s and 80s, returned in the 21st century as a fetish object of mid-century modern interior design, available from Williams-Sonoma and West Elm in approximately the same configuration it had occupied in the 1958 House Beautiful photograph, its presence in the contemporary living room simultaneously a functional object and a nostalgic reference to a social culture that valued the skills of hospitality and the pleasures of a well-made drink with a seriousness that the subsequent decades have not quite replicated, and have sometimes seemed to miss. There is a particular quality of time that the cocktail party of the 1950s created that deserves its own acknowledgement, independent of the food and the crystal and the conversation management. The cocktail hour imposed a structure on the transition between the working day and the domestic evening that gave the participants, guests and hostess alike, a dedicated social interlude, a period specifically designed for the kind of conversation that is neither purely social nor purely professional, but somewhere in the productive middle distance, where people exchange information about each other's lives and form the impressions that will govern future interactions. This kind of structured social time is genuinely rare in the contemporary entertainment landscape, where the dinner party and the house party and the various informal gatherings that have replaced the cocktail party tend either to run too long and merge into the evening without a clear ending, or to be too brief and too casual to allow the kind of layered conversation that the 2-hour cocktail party at its best produced. The forms are not entirely lost. They are available to anyone willing to set the bar cart up again and time the end of the evening deliberately. What is harder to recover is the shared expectation of that timing, the knowledge on all sides of what the occasion was and what it required and when it was over. In the autumn of 1955, a young woman entering the retail establishment of Bergdorf Goodman on Fifth Avenue in New York City to purchase a dress appropriate for afternoon wear would have been met, at the foundation of her wardrobe requirements, with a very specific challenge. The dress could not be worn without its proper underpinnings, and the proper underpinnings for a 1955 afternoon dress were not a simple matter of undergarments in the general sense, but rather a complex structural system without which the dress itself could not achieve its intended silhouette. The structured feminine silhouette of the mid-decade, that particular configuration of cinched waist, elevated bust and generously curved hip that the new look had introduced in 1947 and which had by 1955 become so thoroughly normalized as the correct female shape that department store mannequins were constructed to its specifications, was not produced by the body that wore it. It was engineered. The foundations that produced it were a minor miracle of industrial textile science, and the woman who understood how to select and combine them correctly possessed a knowledge that was practical, physical, and highly specific to her cultural moment. The girdle was the cornerstone of this structural system, and its dominance in the 1950s underwear market was total in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from a contemporary vantage point. The Maidenform Corporation, which had built its pre-war reputation on the brassiere, devoted significant research and manufacturing capacity throughout the 50s to its girdle lines, as did Warner's, Playtex, and the various regional and department store house brands that filled the middle and lower tiers of the market. The materials technology available for girdle construction was advancing rapidly through the decade, with the introduction of Lastex and then of spandex in the later years, offering alternatives to the pure rubber constructions that had characterized the category through the 40s, constructions that had been hot, relatively inflexible, and prone to deterioration in ways that the newer synthetic fibers were not. By the mid-50s, a woman shopping for a girdle had access to garments that offered genuine comfort improvements over what her mother had worn, even as the basic social requirement to wear one remained entirely unchanged. The girdle was not optional equipment for a woman with aspirations to correct dress. It was as obligatory as shoes. The crinoline and petticoat situation was a matter of acute social seriousness throughout the decade, particularly in the context of the circle skirt and the full-skirted cocktail dress that dominated mid-century fashion illustration and fashion photography. A skirt of the full circle, cut that characterized much of the decade's most characteristic clothing, required a specific underskirt infrastructure to achieve its intended shape. Too little crinoline, and the skirt hung limply, looking unfinished and slightly defeated. Too much, and it became comically enormous, the woman inside it appearing to have been inserted into a bell. The correct amount of crinoline was a judgment that required experience and physical self-awareness, and the woman who had calibrated her petticoat situation correctly for her specific body proportions and the specific skirt she was wearing occupied a position of genuine sartorial knowledge. Starching was the complicating variable. A starched crinoline had a crispness and a structural resilience that an unstarched one could not match, but it was also significantly less comfortable against the leg on a warm afternoon, and the management of this trade-off was one of the small but genuine decisions of mid-century dressed life. The glove requirement, which strikes the modern reader as perhaps the most extreme single item in the mid-century dress code, was in 1955 not a formality peculiar to debutante or formal occasions, but a general expectation of correct daytime dress above a certain social register. White cotton gloves for summer, grey or black kid for the cooler months, elbow length for evening, and wrist length for day. The variations encoded season, occasion, and social aspiration in a system so codified that the selection of the wrong glove type for a specific occasion was understood as a legible social error rather than merely an aesthetic one. The practical inconvenience of gloves in daily life, the difficulty of operating a wallet, of managing a telephone dial, of executing the small motor tasks that fill a working day, was understood as the price of correct presentation, a cost that was simply built into the calculation of what proper public appearance required. The specific rules governing daylight versus evening outerwear represented yet another layer of this elaborate system of sartorial prescription. A coat appropriate for a morning shopping expedition was not appropriate for an afternoon social call, and neither was appropriate for an evening engagement. The transitions between these categories were marked by specific material, length, and silhouette requirements that respectable women's magazines documented with the seriousness of reference material, and the woman who appeared at an afternoon bridge party in a coat intended for morning wear was making a statement about her knowledge of these requirements that her social circle would notice and evaluate. The interesting historical reality is that most women of the period navigated this system with remarkable competence, not because they had unlimited clothing budgets, but because they understood the rules well enough to work within them creatively, achieving appropriate presentation across multiple social contexts with wardrobes that were, by contemporary standards, quite small. The discipline of the mid-century wardrobe was real, and it produced, in the women who mastered it, a form of sartorial intelligence that the subsequent liberation from these rules has not entirely replaced. The brassiere technology of the early 1950s was in a state of rapid and occasionally startling development, driven by a combination of genuine engineering ambition and the very specific requirements of the decade's dominant silhouette. The pointed, structured breast shape that characterized so much 1950s women's fashion, and that appears, in retrospect, less like a natural anatomical form than like an architectural decision, was produced not by the bra alone, but by the bra in combination with the specific cut of garments designed to accommodate its particular geometry. The spiral stitching construction that created the conical breast cup was a technique developed by several manufacturers simultaneously in the late 40s and applied with increasing sophistication throughout the 50s. The maiden-form chansonnette, introduced in 1949, was perhaps the best-known example of this construction, and its distinctive silhouette was so pervasive in the fashion advertising of the period that it shaped the entire visual vocabulary of female torso presentation for a decade. Wearing the chansonnette, or the various competitors it inspired, under a sweater or a fitted bodice produced a chest geometry that had no natural equivalent, and that was so thoroughly normalized by its ubiquity and fashion imagery that it appeared, to women and men of the period, to be simply what a woman's figure looked like when correctly dressed. The foundations required for evening wear presented a different and in some respects more challenging set of problems than those required for daytime dress. A strapless evening gown and the strapless silhouette was enormously prominent in evening fashion throughout the mid-decade, required a strapless foundation that could maintain its position through an evening of dancing, sitting and standing, without the structural support of shoulder straps, relying entirely on compression, internal boning, and the strategic application of friction between the garment and the skin to remain in place. The engineering of this solution was a genuine challenge, and the resulting garments, the strapless long-line bra, the corselet that combined bra and girdle functions in a single long foundation, were marvels of practical textile engineering that the women wearing them often found simultaneously transformative and exhausting. The experience of wearing a boned strapless corselet for a 5-hour formal event was a specific kind of physical endurance test that the clothing of the period required of its female wearers in a way that had no male equivalent. The department store fitting room was the space where the abstract requirements of the dress code met the concrete reality of individual bodies, and the saleswomen who staffed the corsetry and foundations departments were practitioners of a specialized service that required both technical knowledge and considerable social skill. The measurement-taking ritual, the tape measure applied at bust, waist and hip, the numbers translated into a size recommendation that the saleswoman would then cross-reference against the specific garment requirements of whatever the customer planned to wear, was intimate in a way that required a particular professional manner, and the best corsetry saleswomen of the period were able to conduct this process with a matter-of-fact efficiency that removed awkwardness without coldness. They were also required to have genuine expertise in fit, to be able to identify when a foundation garment was creating a problem rather than solving one, when the customer's self-assessment of her size requirements was less accurate than the evidence of the garment itself. The hat requirement, which sat at the top of the elaborate sartorial system, and which is perhaps the most completely defunct of all the period's dress conventions, operated as a kind of keystone in the arch of correct daytime presentation through most of the decade. A woman in an appropriate suit with appropriate gloves and appropriate shoes, who appeared for a formal afternoon occasion without a hat, was making a legible omission. She was visibly missing a required element of the costume, and the absence would be noted. The hat performed a function in the social semiotics of mid-century dress that no single garment performs in contemporary wardrobe. It completed the look in a way that declared the look intentional, finished, and correctly calibrated for its occasion. The collapse of the hat as a mandatory element of women's dress, which happened with remarkable speed in the early 1960s, was therefore not simply a fashion change but a structural change in the way dress communicated social positioning. A removal of one of the clearest signals by which women had declared their sartorial seriousness to the social world they moved through. The decline of the structured undergarment as a daily requirement for respectable female dress, which began in the middle of the 1960s with the introduction of more relaxed silhouettes, and the cultural shift toward what the fashion industry described as natural dressing, was one of the most consequential changes in women's physical daily experience in the 20th century. For the women of the 1950s who had worn girdles and long-line bras and boned corselets as simply the default condition of their dressed bodies, the relaxation of these requirements was experienced as a physical liberation of an almost literal kind. The discovery that the body could move through a workday without the constant low-level pressure and constraint that the foundation garments had imposed. This discovery was accompanied, however, by a set of anxieties that the foundations had, in their way, been managing. Without the structural support of the girdle, the female body in its daily movement was visible in ways that had been carefully controlled by the previous generation's underwear architecture, and the transition from one era's dress conventions to another's required women to renegotiate their relationship to their own bodies in motion in public spaces in ways that were sometimes experienced as exhilarating and sometimes as exposing. The wardrobe decrees of the 1950s were demanding and in certain respects punishing, but they also provided a clarity of expectation, a comprehensive set of answers to the daily question of what to wear and how to wear it, that their relaxation replaced with a freedom that could feel, on difficult mornings in front of the closet, very much like being on one's own. The women who had mastered the debutante wardrobe system had a specific and complete competence. The women who inherited the subsequent era's open-ended sartorial freedom had to construct their own criteria, which was in its way a more demanding and a more interesting problem. The debutante wardrobe of the 1950s was, for all its demands and all its rigidities, a genuine form of visual intelligence, a way of reading social environments and responding to them with precision that required both knowledge and judgment to execute well. The woman who got it right was not simply following rules, she was demonstrating that she understood why the rules existed, what social function they served, and how to navigate within them with enough fluency to make the navigation look effortless. That kind of contextual intelligence, The ability to read a situation and dress it correctly, to communicate through clothing choices with sufficient precision that the message arrives as intended, has not become less valuable in the decades since the specific conventions of the 1950s were relaxed. It has become more difficult to acquire because the shared conventions that provided its grammar have been replaced by a sartorial pluralism that puts the entire weight of contextual interpretation on the individual. On the 6th of June, 1944, the women working the production lines of the Revlon factory in New Jersey were wearing red lipstick. This is not a detail recorded in any official history of the day. It is a detail reconstructed from the visual record. The factory photographs taken by industrial photographers documenting the war production effort, the candid images published in Life magazine and Look throughout the war years, the Homefront documentary footage that shows women in their work clothes and their carefully maintained faces performing the precise and essential industrial labour that was keeping the Allied war effort supplied. The red lipstick in these images is not incidental. It was, in the specific cultural context of wartime America, understood as a form of patriotic self-maintenance, a declaration that the conditions of war would not reduce American women to plainness, that the disciplines of femininity would be sustained against the disruption of the normal social order, that beauty was not a frivolity to be surrendered in the face of emergency, but rather one of the things being fought for. When the war ended and the men came home and the factories readjusted, and the culture began its complex renegotiation of what women's lives should look like in peacetime, the red lipstick came with it, carrying all the wartime weight it had accumulated, transformed by its association with female competence and female endurance into something considerably more complicated than a cosmetic product. The peacetime pivot of the red lip from wartime armour to post-war femininity was managed with extraordinary corporate dexterity by Charles Revson, the founder of Revlon, whose marketing instincts were so precisely calibrated to the anxieties and aspirations of post-war American women that his story belongs as much to cultural history as to business history. Revson had built Revlon's original reputation on nail enamel, pioneering the concept of matched lip and nail colour. The Matching Lips and Tips campaign that Revlon launched in the late 1940s generated a cultural norm so durable that the concept of deliberately coordinating lipstick and nail polish colour continues to exert influence on cosmetics marketing 75 years later. When Revlon extended its operations into the lipstick market with full commitment in the early 1950s, it brought to that category the same marketing philosophy that had made its nail enamel dominant. The conviction that the names given to colours were as important as the colours themselves, that a woman buying a red lipstick was not merely purchasing a pigment formulation, but enrolling herself in a narrative, and that the narrative should be specific, aspirational, and just slightly out of reach. The Revlon lipstick shade names of the 1950s, Fire and Ice, Cherries in the Snow, Persian Melon, Bachelor's Carnation, were works of calculated creative fiction, and the advertising campaigns that launched them were among the most sophisticated consumer marketing operations of the decade. The Fire and Ice campaign of 1952 built around a questionnaire that asked women to confess whether they were the kind of woman who would accept a mink coat from a man she had just met or wear a backless dress to a formal function, positioned the purchase of a single lipstick as an act of self-identification with a specific and alluring feminine archetype. This was not cosmetics advertising, it was personality testing with a product at the end of it, and it sold millions of units. The Tangy story, running parallel to the Revlon narrative, but in a completely different register, illuminated the other pole of the mid-century red lip. Tangy Natural, which had been the dominant lipstick brand through much of the 1930s and 40s, built its entire identity on the promise of colour that responded to individual skin chemistry, a formula that appeared orange in the tube but was supposed to adjust to a uniquely personal shade on each individual wearer's lips. The Tangy philosophy was exactly the opposite of Revlon's. Where Revlon offered aspiration and theatrical self-transformation, Tangy offered nature, individuality, and the promise that the best version of a woman's appearance was simply the fullest expression of her own natural colouring. Both philosophies were fictions, of course. A lipstick either stays the colour it is in the tube or it does not, and sophisticated mid-century chemists knew quite well that what Tangy's formula was actually doing was not personalising itself to individual chemistry, but simply going slightly transparent on the lips, with the result that each woman's natural lip colour showed through to a greater or lesser degree. But the fiction Tangy was selling touched something real, The desire to be beautiful on one's own terms rather than on the terms set by someone else's vision of what the ideal female face should look like. The red lipstick that a woman applied in the 1950s was carrying all of this history on its small, slightly waxy surface. It was carrying the wartime legacy, the Revlon aspiration, the tangy individualism, the debutante wardrobe systems, the charm school posture, the doe eye drawn in careful liquid liner, the cold cream ritual of the night before. It was the final step in a system of self-presentation so elaborate and so deeply coded that its full weight could only be understood from outside it, at a distance of decades sufficient to see it whole. The women who applied that lipstick and walked out of their houses into the 1950s morning were not thinking about cultural history. They were thinking about the day ahead, about the tasks that needed doing, about the people they were going to see. But they were also, in a way they felt and rarely articulated, armoured, equipped for the public world by a ritual of preparation that was simultaneously beautiful and demanding, an expression of the era's particular understanding of what a woman owed herself and what the world expected in return. The formulation science behind the iconic red lipsticks of the 1950s was more sophisticated than the product's apparent simplicity would suggest, and the chemistry of colour in particular was an area of active research and competitive development throughout the decade. The problem with red pigments in cosmetic formulations had always been their tendency to migrate, to bleed from the defined lip line into the fine lines of the surrounding skin in a way that destroyed the precision of application and produced by the middle of the afternoon something significantly less elegant than the morning's careful work. This solution that Hazel Bishop had developed for her original lasting lipstick, launched in 1950 and a genuine commercial phenomenon throughout the first half of the decade, was a bromo acid dye system that stained the lips rather than merely coating them, the colour penetrating the surface of the lip tissue rather than sitting on top of it, which produced a significantly better resistance to migration and to the ordinary abrasion of eating and drinking. Bishop's formula was not the first staining lipstick, but her marketing of the concept as kiss-proof, a claim that her advertising tested with photographs of men's shirt collars bearing no trace of the lipstick they had theoretically come into contact with, was a marketing masterstroke that defined the value proposition of the category for the remainder of the decade. The competition between Bishop and Revlon's Charles Revson in the early 1950s is one of the more entertaining episodes in the commercial history of mid-century American beauty, because it was waged with the intensity of genuine personal animosity on both sides. Revson, who had not initially taken the long-wearing lipstick category seriously, found himself outmaneuvered when Bishop's lasting lipstick achieved the kind of market penetration that suggested it was redefining consumer expectations rather than simply capturing a niche. His response was to commission his own research team to develop a competitive long-wearing formula and to devote Revlon's considerable advertising resources to burying Bishop under the weight of the Fire and Ice campaign and its successors, a strategy that worked in the market while doing nothing to address the technical inferiority of Revlon's early long-wearing formulas, which were acknowledged by knowledgeable observers to be less effective than Bishop's original. By the middle of the decade, Revlon's formula had caught up, and the company's marketing dominance had effectively subsumed the long-wearing lipstick category under the Revlon brand identity regardless of who had actually pioneered the technology. The lipstick applicator and packaging of the period was itself an object of design ambition that the industry invested in with consistent seriousness. The standard bullet and swivel case of the 1950s was a more refined object than its functional purpose strictly required, its mechanism designed to extend the lipstick to the correct height for application with a firm but smooth rotation and to retract it with equal precision, the exterior case finished in metallic paint or wrapped in grosgrain or set with decorative enamel work depending on the price point and the brand. Carrying a lipstick was a different kind of cosmetic gesture than carrying a compact. The compact was produced and used with a certain deliberateness, requiring both hands and a moment of attention. The lipstick, by contrast, could be extracted from the purse, applied by feel and habit without a mirror, and returned to the purse in a sequence that some practiced women could complete in under 15 seconds. This efficiency was part of the lipstick's social value. It allowed the maintenance of the red lip in public spaces with a minimum of ceremony, a quick refreshment rather than a full grooming event. The women who wore red lipstick in 1955 America were inheritors of a long and complicated tradition that stretched back through the wartime home front, through the pre-war theatrical and screen cultures that had maintained the red lip as a symbol of deliberate, self-aware femininity through the suffragette movement in the early decades of the century, in which red lipstick had been a specific and conscious symbol of women's defiance of conventional expectations about feminine propriety, and ultimately back to the ancient associations between red pigment and female vitality that appear in the cosmetic practices of cultures across the full span of recorded history. None of this history was necessarily in a 1950s woman's conscious mind as she applied her Revlon fire and ice at the bathroom mirror on a Tuesday morning in September of 1956. But it was in the culture that had taught her to want the red lip, and it was in the social responses her red lip would generate throughout the day, the glances of recognition, the small authority it conferred, the particular kind of visibility it created. The beauty lessons she had learned were never simply lessons about appearance. They were lessons about presence, about the specific kind of attention a carefully composed face could command in a world that paid close attention to female faces, and about the quiet, daily, occasionally exhausting work of making oneself legible in exactly the way one intended to be read. The beauty lessons that the title of this series names, the lessons that grandmother never had to Google, because she learned them through a living transmission of knowledge between women, in the powder room of the department store, at the cosmetics counter, where a saleswoman held a mirror at an angle she had never considered, in the bathroom of her mother's house where the cold cream jar and the setting lotion and the compact and the liner brush were arrayed on the shelf as evidence of a daily practice she was being initiated into, were not simply lessons about products or techniques. They were lessons about what it meant to be a woman in a particular time and place, about what that time and place required of women, and what it offered them in return, about the pleasures and the burdens that were bundled together in the elaborate preparation ritual that stood between the private self and the public world. The women who learned these lessons and practiced them faithfully were doing something that was simultaneously more and less than it appeared to be. More, because the skills they were developing and the daily discipline they were maintaining constituted a genuine form of knowledge and a genuine relationship to the care of the self. Less, because the framework within which that care was practiced was shaped by forces that were not always operating in the interest of the women the framework claimed to serve. The red lipstick snapped shut in its silver case and returned to the purse after the morning's final check in the hallway mirror carried all of this: the history, the aspiration, the pleasure, the pressure, the genuine craft, and the invisible weight of an era's specific ideas about what women should be. It was armour, and it was beautiful, and it was both things without contradiction. The red lipstick endures. Every generation rediscovers it. Every generation finds in it something of what the women of the 1950s found. The particular confidence of a face that has been deliberately, beautifully finished,